Now, this is the 9th lecture, and I'm still Dan, who was talking to you before. In this 9th lecture, we want to look at the New Testament canon. To understand the New Testament canon, I should say just a little bit about the 4 genres or literary styles of books in the New Testament. There are Gospels, which are documents that deal with the story of Jesus. There is one book called Acts, which deals with the narrative history of the early Christians. There are quite a number of letters, 13 of which bear the signature of St. Paul, and then there are some others besides that. And finally, there is one book called an Apocalypse, which in the very first line in the Greek text says the Apocalypse of John, which God gave to him. So as we talk about the New Testament canon, those books that form Scripture in the New Testament, we need to keep in mind these 4 genres. One reason we need to keep this in mind is because in the early church period, there were a number of other works written by early Christians that claimed to be Gospels, or claimed to be letters, or claimed to be Acts, and yet they were not accepted into the canon. One advantage we have in the New Testament that was not true in the Old Testament is that all branches of Christianity agree on the books of the New Testament. So whether you are Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or Protestant, you will have exactly the same books in the New Testament. So there's not this problem that we had with the Apocrypha in the Old Testament. Now, not all of the writings from the apostolic era survived. Paul wrote a number of things that probably did not make it to his descendants. In fact, there's a couple of places we know that happened. Luke, for instance, also mentions that when he began to write his gospel, there were various other people who had already begun to write accounts of the life of Jesus, and Luke was aware of them. None of these other accounts have survived into the modern period, so we don't know what they looked like. It is often speculated that they probably were gospels of the sayings of Jesus. Not so much the narratives, but the sayings. But we don't know that for sure. That's a speculative idea, and it can't be verified one way or another. We also know that Paul wrote some things that don't make it into the modern era, and one of them is a letter to the Corinthians. When Paul wrote what we call 1 Corinthians, he mentions in this letter that he already has written to them. So odd as though it may seem, what we call 1 Corinthians is at least 2 Corinthians, and on down the line. We also know that Paul wrote a letter to the church at Laodicea, the church that is mentioned in the book of Revelation as one of the 7 churches in Asia Minor. This letter has not survived either, unless it may be a form of the Ephesian letter. Now, there is an argument that the Ephesian letter was a circular letter and was intended to go to several churches, the main one being Ephesus, but others might include churches like Laodicea. Again, this is a speculative possibility, and it may in fact be true, but we cannot demonstrate that it is true. If that is not true, then there is a letter to the Laodiceans that Paul wrote that has not survived into the modern era. He mentions it at the end of the Colossian letter, and he tells the Colossians that they should read the letter from Laodicea, and tells the Laodiceans, by the same token, they should read the Colossian letter. But we do not have a text of this Colossian letter. So when we talk about the fixing of the New Testament canon, we are not saying that everything that Paul wrote goes into it, because we don't have everything that Paul wrote. And that would be true of the other writers of the New Testament as well. Furthermore, we need to understand that the New Testament canon was fixed gradually over a fairly lengthy period of time, roughly about 3 centuries. There wasn't some sort of council that met somewhere and sat down with a big pile of manuscripts on their desk and sorted through them and says, well, we're going to keep these and we're going to put these aside. It wasn't nearly that simple. Rather, the canon was fixed gradually by recognition in the widespread of the Christian community and the reading of these scriptures in the churches. The earliest canon lists are not uniform. And in fact, this is probably because not all of the books were available at the same time. In the earliest periods, there would be some books available before other books. And in fact, some individual congregations might have one gospel, they might have 3 or 4 of Paul's letters, and then a few years later they might have another gospel that has come to them and they've been able to copy it, and maybe a few extra letters of Paul, or maybe letters by someone else. But these early canon lists list the books that they had available to them. The earliest canon list we have really is a canon list by someone who was declared to be a heretic, and his name is Marcion. Marcion had a real disagreement about the value of the Old Testament. And so not only did he reject the Old Testament, he rejected those books that sounded too much like the Old Testament. So he didn't think that we ought to be reading Matthew, and he didn't think we ought to be reading Mark or John. He only accepted Luke. And of the letters that bear Paul's name, he only accepted 10 of those and none of the others. Marcion, in the end, was declared to be a heretic, but his canon list, even though it is a list that does not agree with the majority of Christians, still was important because it gave impetus to the idea that Christians ought to think about this issue. Prior to Marcion, probably not too many Christians were thinking about it in any case, but after Marcion, they began to think about it pretty seriously. What books actually belong to our scriptures? The earliest canonical canon list is called the Muratorian Fragment. This list is fragmented at the top. The top of the list has been damaged, so it doesn't show the first 2 books in the list. The first one that is readable is called Luke and is designated as the 3rd gospel. Following that, of course, is John and on down the line. So that would seem to suggest that the first and the second books of the New Testament probably are the Matthew and the Mark that we know today. And most scholars would agree with that. However, when you get near the end of the Muratorian Fragment list, you don't find Hebrews, and you don't find James, and you don't find 1st and 2nd Peter. We don't know why. It could be that these books simply had not circulated widely enough and the author of the Muratorian Fragment was not aware of them. Or it could be that he had questions about them. We simply don't know. The old Syriac translation, which is one of the oldest Christian translations in existence, also omits 2 Peter, but it also omits 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. And again, we don't know why. There's no discussion as to why those books are not there, so we're not sure if they are simply unavailable or whether there is some doubt about them. The Old Latin omits Hebrews, it omits James, it omits 1st and 2nd Peter. So you're seeing some repetition here in the books that are omitted, but again, we don't know why. Finally, there is one very early manuscript from about roughly the 3rd century AD, and this is Codex Sinaiticus. I showed you a picture of one of the pages of it in one of the earlier lectures, a slide of that. And while this book contains all 27 books of the New Testament, it actually contains 2 more. It contains the letter of Barnabas and the shepherd of Hermas. So in this edition of the New Testament, there are 29 books. Ultimately, of course, we know that this was settled as 27 books, but all I'm pointing out is that in this very early period, there is quite a lot of discussion going on, and there is not consensus on all of these. By the time you get to the 4th century AD, in the writings of Eusebius, who's a very important church historian, Eusebius says that there are 3 classes of books that Christians hold to be valuable. One of them is canonical. This class includes the 4 Gospels, Acts, the letters of Paul, Hebrews, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation. Then he says there is a second class that is called disputed. Actually, he uses a Greek term, which is antilegumena. That's pretty much of a $4 word. But it's a word that describes things that were disputed or spoken against. And these would include James, Jude, 2 Peter, and 2nd and 3rd John. Then he has a third category that he calls spurious. These would be books that are rejected as scripture by the larger church. And they include the Acts of Paul and Thecla, Hermas, the Apocalypse of Peter, the letter of Barnabas, the Didache, and then he says perhaps Revelation. However, the Revelation he's talking about is probably not the Revelation that we're familiar with, because there was actually another document called Revelation that was a Gnostic gospel or a Gnostic apocalypse. Most of the books that fall into the spurious class belong to the Gnostic cult. And Gnostics were considered to be heretics by the early church because they were believed to have distorted the story of Jesus. Finally, we get to 367 AD. Athanasius writes his 39th Easter letter to all of the churches throughout all of the empire, and he lists what today we call the New Testament. All 27 books, no more, no less. This is the earliest list of the New Testament that we have to date exactly as we read it in our English Bibles. Augustine supported this canon list. Also, Jerome in the Vulgate supported this canon list. So when he translated the Bible into Latin, he translated these 27 books. Now, there were various early Gospels beside the 4 Gospels that we find in our Bibles. And you will see a list of them here, quite a number of them. And almost all of them come from Gnostic forms of religion. Gnosticism was an attempt to blend Greek philosophy with Christian thought. And so a lot of these Gospels have some unusual aspects to them. The same is going to be true of works called Acts. There's several of those. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Acts of Peter, the Acts of John, and so on. None of these are believed to be written by the people whose name appears in the title. They're written much later than that, but they are written using their names, and usually about 100 and sometimes even longer, 100 years more or later than these people lived. There are also some letters, like 3 Corinthians or the Laodiceans or Alexandrians. There's really a really interesting one called the letter of Jesus, that Jesus is supposed to have written a letter to somebody. We actually don't think Jesus wrote this letter or that any of these other people wrote these letters. But they still were accepted within the Gnostic community. And then there were early apocalypses that were not accepted as canonical. The Ascension of Isaiah, the Apocalypse of Peter, various books like that. So when we get to the end of the New Testament canon, we see that this canon was formed by a process of the early church as they examined the text, as they read the text, as they used the text as scripture. And one of the primary factors was that they considered these texts to be inspired by God. And so they formed the canon of the New Testament. This is the end of lecture number 9.